Prairie Yard and Garden is a production of the University of Minnesota Morris in cooperation with Pioneer Public Television. Additional support provided by Mark and Margaret Yekel Julien in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. ShalomHillFarm.org.
I don't know what is causing the bumper crop of weeds in my yard this year. I just can't seem to get ahead of them, and many people have told me they are fighting the same battle. I'm host Mary Holm, and today we are visiting the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, where they actually have an educational weed display. But I think my yard could give it a run for its money. I've always been told that a weed is just a plant out of place. Well, I have lots of plants out of place this year in my yard. Where most of us have a city lot or several acres to deal with, today Prairie Yard and Garden is visiting with Dan Miller, who has over 1,000 acres to care for at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. Welcome, Dan.
Well, welcome, Mary, to the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. Today we are at the Barron's Weed Exhibit, and this exhibit has been here since 2005. It has 36 different representatives of weeds. Some of them are weeds of yards, some of them are lawns, some of them of garden areas, and some of them of natural areas. So we will talk a little bit about each kind today.
Dan, I've heard the term of weeds referred to as annuals, biennials, and perennials. Can you explain what is meant by those terms?
An annual weed is a plant that completes its life cycle in 1 year. So in the spring it'll grow up, produce seed and set seed, and then seed itself and then die in 1 year. But unfortunately, a lot of times it leaves a lot of seed behind for the next growing year. A biennial completes its life cycle in 2 years. So the first year it's usually just in a vegetative state, and it overwinters that way. And then the second year it shoots up a spike with flowers on it and produces seed and reproduces. A perennial, every year it comes up from the roots, it produces seed and then dies back at the end of the year and survives the winter just in the roots. The roots survive.
I've also heard the term a grassy weed as compared to a broadleaf weed. What do we mean by that?
Well, grassy weeds are the grasses and sedges. The sedges also fall into that category. They are monocots, and the broadleafs are deciduous usually. They are plants with several different leaves in a completely different arrangement, and it's important to know the difference between the two, because a lot of the control methods are different for the grassy ones than they are for the broadleaf ones.
How can people tell what weeds they're trying to control? What kind of resources can they use to find out?
One of the best sources of information, it comes from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and they have a noxious weed list, and they actually categorize the weeds into the ones that are the most dangerous. There are some new ones that are on what's called their eradicate list. They're ones that have just started to come into the area, and they would like people to completely eradicate them. Even poison ivy is on their list. So they have very good information, and there's links to each weed with specific information about the biology and the control. Another excellent source is the extension people and master gardeners. A lot of times they are pretty well trained on how to control weeds.
So once people have identified what their weeds are, how will they know what to look for to control the particular weed that they're dealing with?
Well, they'll have to look at the products and get an idea from previous information on what they might need. There are many different types of herbicides. There are ones that are pre-emergent that you apply before the weeds gets germinating, especially like with crabgrass. You can apply a pre-emergent weed, and that'll actually kill the seeds that are starting, the seedlings that are starting to germinate. And then there's post-emergent types too. There's also ones that are selective for that type of weed, but there are also ones that are non-selective, like glyphosate, which kills just about everything. So it has to be, if you use that, it has to be applied only to what you want to kill. So there's many different kinds. Once you know what the weed is, a lot of times you can get the recommendations as what you need to use. It's very important though, for if you buy a product, to read the label. The label tells you everything you need to know. It's actually an official document. It has all the information about how, about environmental concerns about it. Maybe it could be something that could cause problems with bees, so you need to be aware of that. It could be something that could also cause problems with aquatic organisms. So all the environmental concerns are on there. Also, anything that regards your safety. So it will recommend, they will recommend what type of clothing you may need to wear. You might have to, they might recommend long pants, long sleeve shirts, and gloves. In some cases, they may even recommend that some type of a respirator, especially more in the commercial type pesticides. But the label is a really good source of information. It'll tell you how to correctly mix it, and so you don't over apply. And that's another very important thing. A lot of times people add too much and they try to make it too strong when they don't really need to, and it can cause other problems. So the label is very important, that it is followed very closely, and it should be, the whole thing should be read before you apply your product.
I've heard of a term active ingredient too. How does that tie into the label?
It'll tell you the percentage of the active ingredient, which is the part that is actually going to be killing the weed. The other parts are inert, or they're additives to help. They may be to help spread out the herbicide more on the leaf. There might be other things that are added. I mean, some of it could even be water that's added.
When is the best time to control weeds?
It depends on what they are. The perennial weeds like Canada thistle, a lot of times it's best to get them early in the growing season. Try to control them in maybe early June, but then hit them up hard in the fall. And perennial weeds, they must store their carbohydrates or their reserves into the roots for the winter. And so if you hit them up hard with, especially with like glyphosate, which is a systemic type herbicide. Systemic means that it's going to be translocated or spread throughout into the roots. If you're using something like that, the plant is getting ready for the winter, and so it's starting to store all these sugars and carbohydrates into the roots. And so if you hit it at the right time, then it'll go down into the roots and it'll be very effective in killing them. There's many things that are better to control in the spring. Usually the middle of the summer is not the best time to control, but if you're just spot treating things in your yard, you can do that. And of course, cracks in your concrete, you can get those in the summertime. Plants that are coming up in those cracks with glyphosate type products, and there are some other broadleafs that'll do that. But yeah, it depends on the plant as to when is the best time of the year.
I'm sure that if you have a plant that produces a lot of seeds, you really want to try to get rid of those seeds so that you don't have to live with them for the next year.
Yes, things like red root pigweed, they produce up to, one plant can produce 10 to 30,000 seeds. And if those seeds, if you don't get those seeds early, they're going to be there for next year, and they can last in the soil for a long time. So especially the annual type weeds that produce a lot of seeds, it's important to try to get them early in the year. You don't necessarily need to, be using herbicides on them. A lot of times just by hoeing or hand pulling will be the best way to control them.
Well, and sometimes if I only have a few dandelions in my yard, I will also take a digger out and hand dig and hand pull some of those too.
Yeah, I actually, as much as you can do by hand pulling or by cultivating with a hoe or any of that, is probably can be the best method of control. And there are many, many weeds that can be controlled that way, just by pulling them out, cutting them off, preventing them from going to seed. With dandelions, if you don't have too many, those dandelion diggers that work pretty well. If you have some extra time, just go out in your backyard and try to get rid of those, and you may be able to knock it back. Actually, even small patches of creeping Charlie you can get just by hand pulling out of your yard. And especially in your garden where there's bare soil, those weeds can be really easy to pull out if you just keep on top of it.
What are some cultural practices that we can use to help prevent weeds?
Well, in the garden, also you can use mulches. So if you mulch around your plants, that's also good for conserving water, but it also will prevent a lot of weeds from growing. There's areas where people can actually smother them, and you can take newspapers and cover the soil with newspapers and then weight it down with a little bit of soil, and that'll prevent them from coming up. In the lawn, just proper mowing, proper fertilization and watering can control most of the weeds. They say that proper mowing by itself can control up to 80% of your weeds. And by proper mowing, the grass becomes more competitive. The grass becomes denser, and it tends to outcompete or shade out some of the weeds. So just proper mowing. Another thing is that you don't want to mow your lawn too short. You want to mow it pretty high, up around 3.5 inches. You want to do it frequently, but only when it's mow it at a higher height, and that'll control a lot of your weeds. So in the lawn, you may not need to use herbicides if you have good, healthy, vigorous turf.
So why is it so important not to mow too short?
Well, it stresses the plants, and it also gives the weeds a better chance to get up above the grass too. So some of the shorter weeds will spring up ahead of the grass, and it'll get more light and they'll grow faster. But one of the main reasons is stress to the grass. If you mow it too short, it can dry out faster, and then once it's stressed, then the weeds can take over. So it's a vigor issue really in the grass. It's more vigorous grass is taller grass.
You are an IPM specialist. What does that mean?
That's integrated pest management, and integrated pest management is a way of controlling pests. It could be diseases, insects, or weeds in a way that does not use pesticides, very many pesticides, or you only use pesticides if you really have to. A big part of it is actually growing healthy plants, preventative. If you do use good gardening practices and grow strong, healthy plants, a lot of times they will defend themselves against pests. But also cultural methods, there are different ways that we've talked about, different cultural methods that can help. There's things like barriers. You can protect your cherries with nets from the birds, things like that. Protect your hostas from the deer with fences, things like that as barriers. But then if you do need to use pesticides, it's a matter of using the least toxic and trying to use levels that are not so high. So the main thing that IPM is, it's ways of reducing pesticide use. And it actually got started back in the early 1960s by Rachel Carson, who wrote the book Silent Springs. And she was a research person who found out that DDT was affecting the fecundity of birds of prey. And she made that link to the DDT and the demise of many of the birds of prey. And she really didn't get a lot of credit until the JFK administration supported her. And then after that, it took off. And I really think that was the beginning of IPM.
Would you be willing to show us some of the common weeds that we would find in our lawns and in our gardens and maybe in our natural areas?
Sure, we can look right here. Here we have, in this garden, several examples of weeds that you can find in your garden area. And here is the red root pigweed that we talked about that is so prolific. As you can see, that easily produces many seeds. Now, pigweed is one that if you can just pull out, if you have an area that has lots of it, just by mowing it off can help, but it's one you probably don't need to use a herbicide on. Another one like that, another annual type weed is lamb's quarter, which we have over here. Lamb's quarters doesn't produce so many seeds, but it does come in pretty fast and grows really quickly. But again, you can hoe it off or you can pull them out, and it's one that you can easily control in your garden just by cultivation. Another one you might have in your garden is purslane, which is a very flat growing, almost succulent looking leaf. And a lot of times that one can also be just pulled out, but it probably doesn't work to just cut it off, because it could send that little piece that you cut off could start a new plant. So with purslane, it's better to pull it up. It's got a tap root. It's easy to pull up, and then maybe turn it upside down so the root is up, and that way it'll dry out and die for sure. But usually you can control weeds like that just by cultivation, and again, as I mentioned, by mulching, or maybe even using smothering them out with newspapers.
I have got oodles of purslane in my yard.
Yeah, it does pretty well in the gardens. There's several other broadleaf weeds that you'll find in your garden, but a lot of them can be easily pulled out. The community garden spot that I have a lot of smartweed that's growing, and it's easy to pull.
Okay. So how about weeds that are a real pain in our lawns? And I know dandelions is going to be on that list. You mentioned that, but what are some of the others?
We have dandelions. I think one of the most interesting ones that people have problems with is creeping Charlie. And creeping Charlie, it's actually in the mint family, and it creeps along. It grows so low. It takes off. It does fairly well in shady spots and wet spots. It can be a big problem. If it's just getting established in your yard, you may be able to just pull it out. Actually, just with a rake, you might be able to get it all out, but you need to get all the parts out. Another thing is, if you mow it, a lot of times if you cut up these pieces and spread them out, those little pieces could start new plants. So you want to mow higher than the creeping Charlie, or you want to bag your clippings if you have a lot of creeping Charlie. There's been a lot of talk about using boron to kill creeping Charlie, but we do not recommend that. It will take levels of boron that are toxic to your lawn, to the grass and everything else, and so boron doesn't really work. There are herbicides you can use in the fall that'll kill creeping Charlie. Usually dicamba in the fall is one of the best methods. Interestingly enough, creeping Charlie is considered more of an important ground cover and is used as a ground cover in places like in England. And so in one place it's a weed, in some place it's not. but for us it's been a big problem. It has that minty smell, so when you mow it, you'll smell it. Creeping Charlie is one of the bigger ones. Of course, crabgrass is a big problem. You don't see it until July. It's a warm season grass. There are pre-emergents, but just by pulling crabgrass and trying to pull it out, that might be able to help. It can be a problem. Pre-emergence will work, but again, if you have a vigorous, healthy turf, the crabgrass will not do very well. Another one that we have here is yellow nutsedge. It's like a grass, but it's actually a little bit different. It has triangular stems. It produces these little tubers underground, and it reproduces that way, but it also reproduces by seed. And nutsedge is a big problem, especially worldwide. It's one of in the top 5 for problems worldwide. If you maintain a healthy turf, that'll reduce it, but that's one you can pull. And if you keep pulling it out, that'll help. Another big one is quackgrass, and that quackgrass could be either in your turf or it could be in the garden. Quackgrass is a problem because it has a very extensive root system, and if you pull it out, it just breaks off. But they say that if you keep at it and you keep breaking it off, eventually it might run out of reserves, and you can get it that way. But quackgrass can be a big problem. You do not want to rototill quackgrass, because if you rototill it, then you're cutting up those root segments and then you're just propagating it. So quackgrass is another one that could be a problem in your turf. So we got dandelions. We have crabgrass. We have a lot of different problems. But again, if you have a healthy turf, you might be able to eliminate those problems.
I have a question. I'd like to incorporate some plants that use less water. What would you recommend?
There's lots of choices. For garden perennials, the sedums as a group are all very drought-tolerant plants. There's the low ground cover sedums that come in yellow or green, or some purple and red varieties. There's some taller ones like Autumn Joy. There's a great plant for attracting butterflies. So those are some good choices. Also our native prairie plants, things like Laetris, some of the native prairie grasses, little blue stem or prairie dropseed are all drought-tolerant plants. And there's choices in flowering in trees and shrubs as well. Behind me here is a tiger-eye sumac. This is a yellow leaf form of the native staghorn sumac that grows on dry roadsides throughout Minnesota. It's a very drought-tolerant plant. Also adds a lot of color to your yard. It keeps this yellow foliage all summer. And then the junipers is another whole group of plants that are all adapted to growing in dry spots.
Ask the Arboretum Experts has been brought to you by the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum in Chanhassen, dedicated to enriching lives through the appreciation and knowledge of plants.
Some of our viewers are people that have woodlands, or they may have cabins with woods and water close by. What are some of the main stinker weeds that they have to worry about?
One of the biggest problems in Minnesota is buckthorn in the woodland areas. And buckthorn has really completely taken over many areas, especially in the Arboretum grounds. It was introduced a long time ago as an ornamental hedge, and the birds spread it. The birds really like it, and they spread it all over, and it outcompetes the native shrubs. And it's pretty hard to control. You have to put a lot of resource into controlling it. We also have garlic mustard, which is a big problem in some areas, and it can completely take over and displace some of the native plants. It can be controlled in the spring by pulling, and there are also some herbicides that can be used. Some people say you can use glyphosate before the native plants are coming up. So it comes up earlier, so a lot of times you can hit it that way. But actually, a lot of times you can just hand pull. Reed canary grass, as I mentioned, is a big problem. Purple loosestrife is one that we use biological control for. Now, we haven't talked about biological control yet, but there are some insects that can be used to help you. For leafy spurge and for purple loosestrife, we have released insects that are very specific to that weed, and they will help control it for you. They will either chew up the leaves or chew up the roots, or maybe even the seed itself. So purple loosestrife is one that we have been using biological control on. One last one that I would like to mention is wild parsnip. And wild parsnip is pretty prevalent in the southeastern part of the state. And the reason that I'd like to talk about it is that it can be very dangerous if you get the sap on your skin. It can cause a reaction, and it's called dermatological response, where if you get the sap on you at night without any ultraviolet light, nothing would happen. But it's a combination of the sap along with ultraviolet lights that will cause a bad rash, a parsnip burn. So you want to be very careful of wild parsnip and try to, if you control it, like you wouldn't want to be wearing shorts and a weed whip, because that would cause the sap to get on your legs and it could cause some bad blisters. So wild parsnip is one that is becoming new to the metro, and I think it's spreading to the western part of the state too. But right now, its main problem is right in the southeastern part of the state.
Wow, that's good to know. So if you're going to go after that, probably wear long sleeves and long pants.
Yes, be aware of the problems that you can have with it. It can be pretty bad. The rash can be very, very serious. Almost like a poison ivy, but more of a blistery type thing. So yeah, that's another one, poison ivy. It's a native plant, but it is a weed, and you need to be aware of what it looks like. That's the main thing, is proper identification. Know where it is, and if you're allergic to it, stay away. A lot of people aren't allergic to it, but most people are.
Oh, I've always heard the word when we went camping, leaves of 3, let it be.
Let it be, that's it. And be aware that it's a plant that can cause serious harm to you.
Well, I really, really appreciate your taking the time to teach us all about these weeds. And now I know what some of these are that are in my own yard. And I just really appreciate all of your help, and thank you for letting us come and see your weed patch here at the Arboretum so we can learn all about them.
Well, thank you and for coming, and it was fun to be able to show you what we have here. And any visitors who come to the Arboretum, come see our weed garden, and you can properly identify what might be growing in your yard or lawn.
Well, thank you so much.
And thank you.
Additional support provided by Mark and Margaret Yekel Julien in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. ShalomHillFarm.org.